So you had this realization that the tools that you were using, the tools that had been used, just were not getting to that root cause. So you spoke a little bit about nutrition. Can you tell us a little more about how nutrition relates to the health of a being?
Yeah, you would think this would be so innate in our training as healers or physicians or scientists even. But what is nutrition? Nutrition is ultimately the delivery of building blocks that will allow for a human body or any physical body, whether it's an animal in the feedlots or wherever you are. The nutrition is really the substrate that goes on to allow the innate blueprint of biology to become a human body. And the extraordinary plasticity of our genome increasingly becomes revealed over the science as the science continues to evolve. We now know that at the molecular level, down at the DNA level, where we kind of come out of this blueprint into a human body, we have huge options. Today, my genome, which will be static for my life as far as the genes that are there, I was handed by my parents. But from those genes, I can make 4 million different bodies, because each gene can make over 200 different protein structures depending on its environment.
Interesting.
And the biggest environmental factor there is the nutrition. So your nutrition today, what you put in your mouth today, is literally who you are becoming. It is shaping everything from your consciousness of who you are, to the metabolism at which you burn calories, to the way in which you store fat instead of burning it for fuel, the way in which your metabolism can crush down and turn into an inflammatory mess, and evolve into chronic disease. All of these things are determined first and foremost, in my opinion, by nutrition. What are we putting in our bodies from the outside world? And then that has an immediate impact on who we become.
So we're living in this world where we've been disconnected from our nature, and we're trying very hard to deal with obesity. We're trying very hard to deal with all of the neurodegenerative diseases and everything that we're dealing with. And yet, where do we get the tools? How do we have any sort of hope for where the tools could be? How does that work?
So the industry is maturing quickly, is the fortunate thing. Humans are incredibly creative and ingenious, and I give great hope in my life to this reality, is that when we find a problem and identify the problem well, and we communicate that between people, solutions pop up all over the place. We have the largest humanitarian crisis that's ever happened in human history happening today, mostly in our children. To put it in perspective, in the 1960s, we had a chronic disease burden in our U.S. population that was around 4%. From cradle to grave, 4% of the people had chronic disease. Today in the United States, our children under the age of 12 carry a chronic disease burden of 46%.
Say that one more time.
46% children under the age of 12.
Less than 50, 60 years later?
Yes, and so in 2 or 3 generations, we've gone from almost non-existent chronic disease in children to half of our children with a chronic disease by the time they're 12. And unfortunately, a lot of these are neurologic, right? Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, major depression, anxiety disorders in children that are pre-pubertal even.
Right.
And so we have this massive neurologic stress going on, and then of course we have the autism phenomenon. We've moved from 1 in 5,000 children in 1975 to 1 in 44 today. Wow. 1 in 5,000, 1 in 44. And so we are at a state where my hope lies entirely in the consumer and the entrepreneur who meet the consumer's demand. My excitement about being on programs like this is we have to get the information and the people that can change the world instantly. And ultimately those people are not legislators, they're not big businesses, they're not even the scientists, they're ultimately the consumer that needs to say, my children are sick. My children have asthma, eczema, food allergies, food sensitivities. My children have mood disorder. As parents, we need to wake up and say, this is what we're facing. And as consumers, we can instantly change that environment by demanding and ultimately participating in a different social structure. We don't have to go back to paleo times to find out how to eat healthy, right? And so if we back up just 60 years, we go back to the end of World War II, there was the great call for the victory gardens. The mission was, if you're a patriot, you're going to grow a garden in your backyard and you're going to grow some food. By the end of World War II, we're growing 45% of our food chain in our backyard gardens. Now we grow less than 0.1% in our backyard gardens. And so we have completely outsourced our food, and so we lost control of it. We created Monsanto, we created the new Bayer with their new GMO. We created these massive entities by outsourcing, by dropping our own personal sense of responsibility or opportunity, if you will, to be in touch with the food.
What is the connection between the microbiome and our metabolism? Because we hear so much as we're dealing with obesity and then this becoming, and is already obviously, an epidemic. We hear so much about, oh, my metabolism has slowed down, or whatever it may be. And like you said, when you bring it even to our children, the rate of diabetes for children is just so incredibly high.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we now know that the microbiome is 100% underlying all of these metabolic changes, which is relatively new. Certainly when I went through endocrine training back in the 2000s, this was not known, but by 2010 it was really clear that the microbiome was involved in some way. And now you fast forward another 8 years, we've actually started to tease out which bacteria are causing obesity. And it's a profound message to everybody listening that, you may have made some massive dietary changes in your life trying to lose weight and you're not losing the weight, or you lost a little bit and you can't get back to your ideal body weight. We've now done experiments where you take the bacteria out of somebody who's struggling with weight and you put those bacteria into the intestines of a rodent, a mouse or a rat, and that animal will become obese in a month. No change in diet, no change in caloric intake. They'll become obese because of the bacteria that are therein. What does that mean? What's happening there? We've now teased out that there are bacteria in your gut that are demanding you to eat food that you shouldn't be eating in the first place. The bacteria can actually change your behavior by the chemicals they put out in your gut and the genes that they modify in your brain.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? You're saying that we're not controlling our own behavior and the cravings, and when we're told willpower, all you have to have is some willpower. Is that even possible?
So willpower is going to come in a different format this time. Instead of you looking at failure as, oh, I just ate that chocolate again, I'm a stupid person, I don't have any self-control or anything else, it's not you that's compelling that. If you start to move back and say, I'm a huge organism with all this living mass in my body that is trying to eat. And if you've developed the bacteria in your gut that are going to prefer a refined carbohydrate as its main intake, it's going to continue to compel you to eat that. In fact, if you go and suddenly switch and you're like, I'm just doing kale salad, well, you're going to be bloated, your inflammation may go up, you actually may feel worse switching over to a whole health plant-based diet in those first couple of weeks because you don't have the bacterial flora that want or can handle that food load. Your bacteria are used to refined carbohydrates or whatever your little niche of the diet is, and so your bacteria can create chemicals that are compelling you to stay in that zone. And then your brain, through its misconception, will reinforce that of like, oh, I feel worse when I eat that. I get more intestinal bloating when I eat that kale salad. So now you start to reinforce poor behavior, and now you start to back up and you're like, is there really a lack of self-control, or do you have all of these bacterial and neurologic signals saying, I need to keep eating what I can handle? And so number one is to realize any dietary change in your life is going to be a process. You need to retrain the ecosystem within your body to want and seek out the food you are really going to thrive on. And this happens largely through developing a relationship of the brain to the nutrients in your food. The first time you eat kale and have a complex experience there where you've got inflammation and maybe some confusion on the bacterial part, your immune system's responding things it doesn't usually have to respond to. The brain doesn't know what's good, what's bad, what's going on. It just knows that there's been a big shift and it's trying to tease it out. But the 5th and 10th and 20th time that you introduce kale or some new ingredient in your diet, the brain starts to realize, whoa, I'm getting this nutrient load 30 minutes to 90 minutes after that food comes in that I was desperately in need of. And it can start to say, I need that. And so you can start to create these, not cravings, but actual knowledge of what the body is needing as you retrain the body. And so look at yourself as an athlete when you go to make a nutritional change. No matter what your capacity is on the track, what your capacity is to eat is really well established. You can eat an enormous amount of calories in a day. Typical American, somewhere around 2,000 calories a day. But for a lot of my women, they've dieted themselves back to 600 calories. They're now a weak organism in the sense that they don't even know how to process food efficiently. They've slowed their metabolism down through this chronic dieting process so that if they eat anything over 600 calories, they start to gain weight again. Think of yourself as an athlete that needs to retrain into a new sport. Your new sport is biodiversity in the gut, in the microbiome. So how do you train that biodiversity? There's a couple of major ways. Number one, get new nutrients into the body, because those new nutrients are going to demand different bacteria and fungi to deal with their process. So number one, train biodiversity by getting diversity on the plate.
What would we do differently when we go to the grocery store?
In the grocery store, you'd be going after colors that you're not used to seeing on the plate. And so one of my favorites is definitely the beet. You know, it's something that was a staple through all of history, really. The beet and the sweet potato, these root vegetables that were our winter crops. This is what we survived for months of the year on, were these tubers and these big root vegetables. These were our staples, and now they become like, you know, every nice restaurant in America now has a beet salad where they have some greens and then they have a few chunks of beet. I'm talking about eating beets, like boil a beet, eat a beet, you know, and the turnip, similar to that, another great one. And then the other roots that we are missing out on color, the radish. You know, we toss a few little slices of radish on top of salad. We don't eat the radish, you know, and so consuming these things in their whole amount, and a high amount of them, can really change the microbiome. Other radishes that are underutilized are like the black radish, which has got a very unique micronutrient in the skin, and then the white daikon radish, which looks like a giant white carrot. And so these are some examples there, but then you get into the fruits, right? It's things like star fruit and lychee fruit, and all these things have got incredible capacity. Then you get into the herbs. The two most powerful things in the herbal world really is probably cilantro, is one of the most overlooked pieces of superfood there, and then parsley. Those two are, if you just make a routine pesto out of parsley, you can get an extraordinary superfood experience out of that. Chlorella, you know, you start to go into the ocean environment, kelps, the seaweeds. All of these are things that are lacking in the American diet massively.
It's fascinating. So we're working on the biodiversity of our microbiome, and that for someone who's been chronically dieting or for someone who's suffering from metabolic disorders can really have a huge impact. And how long does it take to start to retrain?
So retraining happens every minute. It's interesting. This is a very plastic system. The microbiome can shift in a matter of just walking into a hotel. You get an artificial environment with highly processed air that's not getting any out things. You'll change your microbiome in a few seconds. You'll suddenly breathe a bunch of fungi that grow in the air ducts of the hotel or whatever it is, and that can have an immediate shift. So these changes are happening constantly in our body. If we find ourselves from week to week, day to day, with the same biology, which might be healthy or it might be sick, and we keep saying, I'm sick, no matter what I do, I'm sick. I'm still sick, I still have diabetes, I have still this. Well, then what we know, scientifically and mathematically, is you haven't changed your environment. If from one week to the next, you are the same diseased or healthy body, you haven't changed your environment. And so the exciting thing is the plasticity. So we can walk into a hotel, change our microbiome for a moment, but to have a sustainable shift where we're going to really change into a healthy environment, we got to get back to the opposite of the hotel, which is outside in nature. So as we start to breathe nature again, we actually populate our upper respiratory tract, our sinuses, with bacteria that will ultimately seed and inform the rest of our gut, and that will become really the foundation therein. So when I talk about reseeding the gut with bacteria to my patients, we certainly speak about fermented foods, things like wild fermented sauerkrauts, kimchis, sour Reuben, kvass, all of these amazing compounds. These are great, but remember that the vast majority of the microbiome that's going to repopulate the whole upper tract is going to come through breath. And so we have our patients visit as many different ecosystems as they can as quickly as possible. So if I meet a cancer patient, I just take a quick history on their microbiome. What air do you breathe on a daily basis? And what environments do you diversify that from? And by and large, we find that they have basically three environments. They have their home, they have their workplace, and in some situations they'll have like their kids' like extracurricular environments. So they might spend a fair time in the gym because their daughter's in volleyball or whatever it is. So they have like these three kind of major ecosystems that they're in. And then you ask the simple question, which of those ecosystems looks like the nature that you developed with for the last millions of years? And the answer is none of them. A gym is never going to have a microbiome like the deep forests of Virginia where I live, and there's no way that you're going to, in your office place, experience the microbiome that's on the beaches out here in California. You are not touching the ecosystem at this microbiome level in much of your day. And so we have to make a volitional effort to re-engage that. So how do we start to code this all back? It sounds overwhelming, but the reality is tiny baby steps are going to revolutionize public health back to just where we were 30 years ago. Again, we don't have to go back deep in human history to find a healthier microbiome.